He built an empire on blood, silence, and the wreckage of everyone who stood in his way. For 5 years she stood beside him, invisible, loyal, enduring every humiliation without a single complaint. Then one morning, he slid divorce papers across a marble table and told her to sign. She did. No tears, no begging, no scene. He thought he was freeing himself. He thought his first love was coming back to give him everything he'd ever wanted. He had no idea. The woman he threw away was about to become the most powerful person in the room. Like, comment your city and follow. Because this story is only getting started. The rain had been falling for 3 hours by the time Jason Voss reached the 42nd floor. It came down in sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Voss Tower, the kind of rain that swallowed city lights and turned the skyline into something smeared and unrecognizable. The building bore his name in steel letters 12 feet tall above the entrance. The penthouse conference suite bore his furniture, his art, his silence. Everything in this tower had been shaped by his decisions, his money, his will. He stood at the window for a moment before turning around. She was already seated. Elara Vale. Elara Voss, technically, though that name had never quite fit the way he'd imagined when he gave it to her, sat on the far side of the marble conference table with her hands folded in her lap. She wore a gray wool dress, no jewelry except small pearl earrings. Her dark hair pulled back in a way that made her look almost severe. She looked like she was waiting for a business meeting to begin, not like a woman about to be handed the end of her marriage. Josian sat down across from her. He didn't look at her directly. He'd made a habit of that over the last 2 years. Eye contact with Elara had always done something uncomfortable to him, something he couldn't name and had long since stopped trying to. Instead, he straightened the leather folder in front of him, opened it, and slid the document across the marble surface with one hand. 11 pages. His attorneys had been thorough. Sign them, he said. No preamble, no apology, no softening of any edge. Elara looked at the papers. She looked at them for a long moment, long enough that Jason almost said something else, almost filled the silence the way he usually did when silence threatened to expose something he didn't want exposed. But he stopped himself. He had nothing to explain. He had made a decision. He always made decisions cleanly. She reached into her bag, produced a pen, and signed. Every page that required a signature, every initial. She worked through it methodically, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything she did. And when she finished, she stacked the pages neatly and pushed them back across the table. She didn't say anything. She picked up her bag, stood from the chair, and walked toward the door. Elara? She stopped, didn't turn around. Jason had meant to say something practical. Something about the financial settlement, the apartment on Meridian Street they'd agreed she could keep, the timeline for the legal processing, something logistical. Something that kept this in the category of transaction rather than whatever else it might be. What came out was, "You're not going to say anything?" She turned then, looked at him across the length of the conference room, across the marble and the gray light coming through rain-soaked glass. "No," she said quietly, and she left. The door didn't slam. That would have been something. Instead, it closed with a soft, precise click, the kind of sound a well-engineered mechanism makes when it performs exactly as designed. Jason sat in the empty room for 4 minutes. He knew it was 4 minutes because he watched the second hand of the clock on the wall complete 4 full rotations. Then he stood, picked up the signed document, and went back to work. He told himself he felt nothing. He was almost right. The story of Jason Voss and how he became what he was requires some geography. He had not been born into power. He had not inherited it, stumbled into it, or married it. The irony of that last fact was not lost on him in retrospect, though it was lost on him at the time. He had built it, constructed it from the ground up, the way a man builds a fortress, when he has learned early and permanently that the world does not protect anyone who cannot protect themselves. His father, Dominic Voss, had operated a mid-level distribution network out of a warehouse district in the western part of the city. Efficient, ruthless in his way, completely unsentimental about what his business actually was. Jason had grown up watching his father work, watching the way men responded to a certain kind of stillness. Not anger, not threats, but the simple, credible certainty that consequences existed and would be applied. He'd absorbed that lesson before he understood it consciously. When Dominic died, not violently, which surprised everyone, but of a cardiac event at 57, sitting at his desk on an ordinary Tuesday, Jason was 24. He took control of the organization within a week. He had made no announcement, issued no declaration. He had simply walked into every room that mattered, sat down, and been still. And everyone who saw him had understood. By 30, he had tripled the operation's reach. By 32, he had restructured it so thoroughly that the original warehouse district network was barely recognizable beneath the layers of legitimate enterprise he'd constructed above it. Hotels, private equity, commercial real estate, import logistics. The criminal infrastructure remained, but it was buried deep, visible only to those who already knew where to look. He was 34 when he met Alara Vale at a charity function he'd attended for reasons that were primarily political, the kind of political that doesn't appear in any public record. She had been there because she worked for the hospitality company managing the venue. She wasn't a guest. She was troubleshooting a catering crisis in a side hallway when he'd walked through the wrong door and found her standing in a narrow corridor, holding a clipboard, speaking quietly but precisely into a headset while 3 different staff members orbited her in controlled panic. She'd glanced up at him, registered that he was a guest who'd wandered somewhere he shouldn't be, said, "Sir, this area is staff only," without breaking her other conversation, and pointed him back toward the main hall. He had gone, and then he'd stood on the other side of the door for a moment, which was not something Jason Voss did. Standing still in doorways was not a behavior he recognized in himself. He asked the event coordinator who she was. 3 months later, they were seeing each other. 4 months after that, he proposed. Their relationship had moved at the velocity Jason set for everything he decided to pursue. Complete focus, maximum efficiency, no wasted motion. He had decided Alara was what he wanted, and he had proceeded accordingly. What he had not examined carefully enough, in the ruthless audit he would conduct much later, was why he had decided she was what he wanted. Whether it was her specifically, her particular intelligence, the way she thought through problems, the steadiness she carried in the middle of chaos, or whether it was simply that she represented a version of stability he had constructed in his mind as the next logical acquisition. He had not thought about it then. He was very good at not thinking about things that would complicate his forward momentum. Serena Hartwell had been in his life before Alara, long before. He'd been 21 when he met her, which meant he'd been young enough to confuse intensity for depth and obsession for love. She was stunning in the way that certain people are stunning, a physical presence that reorganized the air in whatever room she entered, a laugh that drew attention without seeming to try. She had made Jason feel things he hadn't known he was capable of feeling, which at 21 he had interpreted as proof that she was irreplaceable. She had left 3 years later, and she had left in a way that people who are very beautiful and very aware of it sometimes leave. Not cleanly, not with explanation, but with a gradual withdrawal that left him uncertain for months whether she was actually gone or simply distant. By the time he understood she wasn't coming back, the uncertainty itself had become part of the wound. He hadn't chased her. Pride was a religion to him even then. But he had carried the shape of it forward in ways he didn't fully account for. When he married Alara, he had been certain Serena was the past. He was certain because he was Jason Voss, and when he decided something was true, he proceeded as though it were. The apartment on Meridian Street was smaller than the penthouse. Alara had chosen it during their 3rd year of marriage. During a period when the penthouse had started to feel like a stage set she was living inside rather than a home. She'd furnished it herself, slowly, over months, with things she'd selected because she liked them, rather than because they projected the correct image. A deep blue sofa that was too comfortable to be fashionable. Bookshelves built around the window. A kitchen that smelled of actual cooking rather than catered meals. After the divorce, she moved in completely. She had anticipated some kind of collapse. That was what you were supposed to do. Fall apart. Process the grief. Pass through stages. She had been married for 5 years to a man she had genuinely loved, or had genuinely tried to love, or had spent so long trying to support that the effort and the love had become indistinguishable from each other. Now she was 31, divorced, and living alone in an apartment that was pleasant but small, with no clear identity outside the one she'd built around being Jason Voss's wife. The collapse didn't come. What came instead was something quieter, and she would later understand more dangerous. She started working. Not the careful behind-the-scenes operational support she'd provided to Jason's legitimate businesses during their marriage. The logistics consulting, the vendor negotiations, the quiet financial restructuring she'd done because she'd seen the problems and knew how to fix them, and no one else had been looking closely enough. She started working on her own, for herself, without anyone's framework or permission. She had saved money throughout the marriage, not because she'd anticipated needing it, but because financial independence had always felt like oxygen to her, something you maintain not for any particular plan, but because you couldn't breathe without it. The savings were significant. She'd also spent 5 years watching how Jason's empire operated, understanding the architecture of power and influence from the inside, noting where the inefficiencies lived and where the opportunities were that no one was exploiting. The hospitality industry was her native territory. She'd worked in it before Jason, had planned to build something in it before the trajectory of her life had redirected. She understood the mechanics of how luxury experiences were built and sold and sustained, and she understood something that most people in that industry were still learning, that the highest value clients in the world were not actually being served correctly. They were being dazzled. They were being given performance. What they actually needed was discretion, precision, and the absolute absence of friction. She wrote the business plan in 3 weeks. She spent 4 months refining it, testing assumptions, running projections, consulting with 3 people she trusted absolutely and who had no connection whatsoever to Jason Voss or his world. Then she started making calls. The first indication that something had shifted came 6 weeks after the divorce, and Jason nearly missed it because he was busy being satisfied with his decision. Serena had returned to the city quietly, which was not her nature, but which she had managed by returning through channels that ran adjacent to Jason's world rather than through it. A mutual contact had mentioned she was back, then another contact. Then she had appeared at a private dinner that Jason attended for reasons unrelated to her, sitting 2 seats away from him at a table of 14, wearing green silk and looking at him with an expression that contained both memory and invitation in equal measure. He had not sought her out. He told himself that clearly and believed it clearly. He had not sought her out. She had been placed in his vicinity by coincidence, or by the specific social gravity that powerful people exert on a certain kind of orbit. They had spoken after dinner, on the terrace. The conversation was cautious at first, the way conversations are when they carry weight. Neither party is ready to formally acknowledge. Then it became something else. She had touched his arm, said his name the way she used to, pulled, somehow, not pushed, as though his name were something she was drawing toward her rather than announcing. By the end of the evening, he had her number again. He'd called the next morning because he was a man who acted on decisions rather than letting them ferment. He told himself this was resolution, closure that finally had the shape of completion. He told himself the ache he'd carried since 21 was about to become something whole. He did not tell himself what he was giving up in order to believe that. He was very practiced at the particular skill of not examining costs when he was certain of a destination. But the Meridian Street apartment had no doorman, which was one of the reasons Alara had chosen it. She liked the anonymity. She liked being able to come and go without someone logging her movements, without a staff of people whose professional function was to observe her. She had been in the apartment for 3 weeks when Marcus Drell showed up. Marcus was 45, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the specific watchfulness of a man who had spent decades being paid to notice things other people missed. He had been Jason's head of security intelligence for 7 years, which meant he had spent 7 years being very good at a job that required absolute loyalty to the man who paid him. He knocked. She opened the door and found him standing in the corridor with his hands in his coat pockets, looking not threatening but uncomfortable, which was more unusual. "Marcus." "Mrs. Voss?" He paused. "I'm sorry, Ms. Vale." She let him in, made coffee because her hands needed something to do. He sat at the kitchen table and she put a mug in front of him and sat across from him and waited. "There's something you should know," he said. She looked at him. "About the Heron deal, from 2021. She knew immediately what he meant. The Heron deal was a commercial real estate acquisition, or had presented itself as one. What she had actually spent 3 months untangling in 2021 was a layered money movement operation that three separate parties had constructed beneath the surface of a legitimate transaction designed to extract roughly $11 million from Jason's organization without triggering his financial monitoring systems. She had found it, dismantled it, rerouted the assets, and documented everything without telling Jason, because at the time she had believed, incorrectly, that telling him would require her to explain how she had found it, which would require admitting she'd been examining financial architecture he hadn't asked her to examine, which would lead to a conversation about why she was doing that. And those were conversations their marriage never survived. She had fixed it silently. He had never known it happened. "What about it?" she said. Someone leaked information about it internally, about the fact that it was discovered and shut down. The people who structured it, they know someone caught it. They've been trying to figure out who. She felt something tighten in her chest but kept her face still. "What's the exposure? Right now? Minimal. They don't know it was you. They think it was someone on the financial compliance team." Marcus turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands. "But if they start pulling threads and they find your fingerprints on the documentation, which they might, eventually, it creates a problem." "For Jason. For you," Marcus said. "Not him. You're not in his organization anymore. You don't have his protection. And the people who structured that deal are not the kind of people who accept losing $11 million without wanting some accounting for it." Alara was quiet for a moment. The rain outside, it seemed like it was always raining these weeks, tapped steadily against the kitchen window. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You work for him." Marcus looked at her directly. "I worked for the organization. I work for the people who make the organization function. You made it function in ways he never fully understood." He stood, picked up his coat. "I'm not here officially. He doesn't know I'm here, but I thought you should know the situation." After he left, Alara sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and started working faster. The months that followed had a quality of controlled acceleration that she recognized from the high-pressure phases of her career before Jason, that specific state where you are moving so fast that everything requires absolute precision because there is no margin for correction. She registered the company under the name Oren Hospitality Group. The name had no significance except that it contained no reference to anyone or anything connected to her past. Clean, neutral, hers. She hired her first 3 employees in the 4th month, a financial architect named Priya, who had spent a decade building cost structures for high-end hotel brands and wanted to build something from the ground up, a former concierge director named Sol, who had managed private guest services at 2 of the most exclusive properties in the country, and possessed what could only be described as an encyclopedic understanding of what wealthy people needed before they knew they needed it, and a woman named Renata, who had spent 12 years managing relationships between ultra-high net worth clients and luxury service providers, and who had a network so precise and so trusted that her phone calls were returned within the hour by people who did not return most phone calls within the week. They worked out of Alara's apartment for 2 months, then out of a rented office space in the downtown design district that was small and had no conference room and required everyone to schedule calls around each other's voices. Then out of a proper office she signed a lease for at the beginning of month 7, with a conference room, real furniture, and a view of the river. She did not sleep much. She ate when she remembered to. She worked with a kind of focused ferocity that surprised even herself, as though she'd discovered a furnace that had always been present but had been burning at a fraction of its capacity for years, constrained by a structure that required a certain level of dim. The structure was gone now. She burned at full capacity. Jason and Serena appeared in a society photograph for the first time 8 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Jason had not authorized the photograph. He had not expressly forbidden it either, which was a kind of permission in the world where he operated. They had attended a private auction, an art event, one of those gatherings that existed at the precise intersection of legitimate cultural life and the kind of serious money that doesn't always require explanation. A photographer had been present. The image that circulated afterward showed them standing together at the edge of the main room, Serena with her hand on Jason's arm, her head tilted slightly toward him, her profile cut perfectly by the light. He looked the way he always looked in photographs, like the room was arranged around him, The image reached Alara through a text from a former acquaintance who added no commentary, which was its own commentary. She looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, then put her phone face down on her desk and finished the financial modeling she had been working on. She did not permit herself to feel what the image wanted her to feel. Not because she felt nothing. She was honest with herself about that. She felt something, a complicated, specific pull, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, that doesn't care about decisions or growth or clean narrative resolution. But she had spent 5 years managing her own emotional responses in a marriage where no one asked what she was experiencing. She was very practiced at it. She finished the financial model. Then she called Priya and went through the numbers. What she had not told Marcus, what she had not told anyone and did not intend to tell anyone because the knowledge was both her protection and her exposure, was that the Heron deal documentation was not the only thing she'd built and maintained quietly during her marriage. She had kept records, not aggressively, not with any specific intention to use them. She had kept them the way a person with a certain kind of mind keeps things, because patterns were visible to her that others missed, because she had an almost physical discomfort with information gaps, because documenting what she observed felt like basic due diligence rather than strategy. What she had documented over 5 years, kept in an encrypted archive that existed in 3 physically separated locations and required a key sequence she had memorized rather than written, was a map of Jason's organizational architecture so complete and so precise that it would have value to virtually every entity on every side of the legal divide that separated his operations. She had no intention of using it. She understood its existence clearly. It was not a weapon. It was insurance. The distinction mattered to her, even if it would not matter much to anyone else. She also understood something Marcus had left unspoken during his kitchen table visit. The people who had structured the Heron deal were not acting alone. They had been operating with inside information, access to financial structures that only a small number of people could have provided, which meant the threat wasn't external. It was embedded. And Jason didn't know it. What? The invitation arrived in month 9. Oren Hospitality Group had been building toward its first signature property for 6 months, a boutique luxury venue in the Arts District, the physical embodiment of everything Alara had spent years thinking about while she managed other people's events, other people's empires, other people's visions. It would not be the largest or the most expensive. It would be the most precisely correct, every detail calibrated to create an experience so seamlessly excellent that the people who experienced it would feel for the duration of their stay as though the world had been specifically arranged for their comfort by someone who understood them completely. The grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in November. She sent invitations to 400 people. She did not send one to Jason Voss, but in the world they both inhabited, invitations were not always the mechanism by which people arrived. There were other mechanisms. There were people whose function was to ensure that the right people attended the right events, regardless of whether the paperwork had traveled the conventional route. She knew there was a reasonable probability he would appear. She had made her decisions about that. She had prepared herself for that specific encounter the way she prepared for everything, by thinking through every variable until it lost its power to surprise her. The night of the opening, it rained. Of course it did. Alara stood in the main atrium of the Oren Meridian property at 6:47 in the evening, 13 minutes before the first guests were scheduled to arrive, and permitted herself exactly that long to stand still and look at what she had built. The atrium was 3 stories of warm light and living greenery, textured stone walls and recessed fixtures that illuminated without exposing. It smelled of cedar and citrus, and something faintly floral that Saul had sourced from a perfumist who worked exclusively with hospitality properties and whose name appeared in no public materials. The furniture was custom, the art was real. Everything was calibrated, chosen, tested, and retested against the single question she had applied to every decision. Is this precisely right, or is it only close? Nothing was only close. Priya appeared at her shoulder. We're set, coat check is staffed, service team is briefed, kitchen is ready. A pause. You look terrifying, in a good way. Alara looked down at what she was wearing, a deep charcoal dress, structured at the shoulders, falling cleanly to the floor, with a neckline that was precise rather than dramatic. She had chosen it not to make an entrance. She had chosen it because it was exactly right. "Let's open," she said. But the first 2 hours went the way a well-designed event goes when every detail has been thought through correctly, smoothly enough that the smoothness was invisible. Guests moved through the space. Conversations formed and dissolved. The food was excellent and no one talked about the food, which was the sign that it was working. The wine was chosen to complement without competing. The staff were present when needed and absent when not needed, a quality that required far more training than it appeared to. Alara moved through the room. She spoke to people she needed to speak to. She listened more than she talked. She had always been good at the particular kind of listening that made people feel completely attended to, completely seen, without requiring her to perform any version of herself that wasn't true. She was halfway through a conversation with a real estate developer named Cassian Ward, a man who operated 3 significant commercial properties in the Eastern Corridor and whose opinion about what he was experiencing tonight had real market value, when she felt it. Not him, not yet. The shift in the room that preceded him. It was a specific phenomenon. She had observed it for 5 years. The slight reorientation of attention, the way conversations in a certain radius would pause for a fraction of a second, the atmospheric change that powerful people create simply by being present. She'd watched it happen around Jason so many times she'd unconsciously memorized its signature. She finished her sentence to Cassian Ward, shook his hand, turned. Jason was standing at the entrance to the atrium. He was alone. She registered that immediately. Alone, not with Serena, not with the usual protective orbit of associates and assistants that normally accompanied him at events of this kind. Just him. In a dark suit that fit the way his suits always fit, with that specific quality of stillness he carried everywhere. The stillness that made people look at him and feel the need to account for themselves. He was looking at her, not at the room, not at the property, at her. Alara held eye contact for 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, then returned her attention to the room around her and kept moving. She had guests to attend to. He had not intended to come. That was what he told himself while standing in a car on the way here, while his driver navigated rain-slicked streets and the city smeared past the windows. He had not intended to come. He had heard about the opening. It was impossible not to, in the circles he moved through, where every significant cultural and commercial event functioned as its own intelligence-gathering opportunity. And he had made a decision not to attend, because attending would require an explanation he wasn't prepared to construct. Then, at 6:15, he had gotten in the car. He did not examine the decision in real time. Examining decisions in real time was something other people did. He moved. What he had not been prepared for, and this was a failure of intelligence that he would have found inexcusable in any operational context, and was forced to find simply true in this personal one, was what he walked into. Not the property, though the property was exceptional in ways that he, who understood exceptional properties, recognized immediately. Not the crowd, though it was exactly the kind of crowd that indicated you had arrived at something that mattered. What he had not been prepared for was Alara. He had known her for 8 years. He had been married to her for 5 of those years. He had looked at her thousands of times. He had looked at her and seen her, and then continued looking beyond her, past her, toward whatever required his attention next, the way you look at a wall and don't fully register it because your attention is allocated elsewhere. He registered her now. She was moving through the room she had built, and it was clearly, unmistakably, her room, her vision, her creation. It had her signature on every surface, though no surface was labeled, with the specific gravity of someone who knew exactly where they were and why they were there and what they were doing. Not confidence as performance. Something structural, something load-bearing. She looked different. That was the flat fact of it, that he couldn't move around. She looked different. Not in any catalogable physical way. Same dark hair, same proportions, same face. Different in the way that people look different when something inside them has changed in ways that rearrange the outside. She had looked at him for 3 seconds when he walked in, direct, steady, without warmth and without hostility. Then she had turned and moved through her room and not looked back. He stood at the edge of the atrium and understood for the first time that he had made a mistake. Not a tactical error, not a miscalculation that could be corrected with application of resources. A mistake. The kind that has a weight that doesn't lift. He found her at 10:45. when the crowd had thinned enough that she was standing near the bar with Sol and a couple of guests, not performing but actually present in the conversation, laughing at something Sol had said. He had not heard Alara laugh in years. He had not noticed he hadn't heard it. Alara. She turned, not startled. She'd known where he was all evening. He understood that now. She had tracked him the way she tracked everything, quietly and completely, and had been ready for this moment when it came. Jason. Professionally pleasant. The kind of tone you use with someone you have a cordial but bounded history with. The guests with her gave them space, reading the room with the social fluency of people who moved in those circles. Sol disappeared into the room with the practiced invisibility of a man who understood his job. They stood facing each other. "This is yours," he said. Not a question, a recognition. "Yes." "It's remarkable." She waited. "I wanted to come and see it," he said, and even as the words came out, he understood they were not the full truth, and that she understood they were not the full truth, and that this particular lie was worse than silence would have been. "I appreciate that," she said evenly. He looked at her. She looked at him. The rain was still happening outside. It pressed against the high windows of the atrium in slow rivulets, city light fragmenting through it. "Alara, you should try the bar program before you leave," she said smoothly, cleanly, no roughness in it, just the redirection of a woman who had decided exactly how much of herself this moment was going to receive. Sol curated it specifically for tonight. It's worth your time. She was already turning away, already finding someone else in the room who needed her attention. He stood in the place she'd left for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he got his coat and left. Outside on the wet sidewalk, waiting for his car, Jason Voss stood in the rain and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Uncertain. Not about his empire. Not about his operations. Not about any of the 100 decisions and threats and calculations that comprised the structure of his daily life. Uncertain about himself. The car arrived. He got in. The driver pulled away from the curb, and the Oran Meridian building slid past the rain-blurred window, warm and lit from within, and he watched it until they turned a corner and it was gone. His phone buzzed. A message from Damien Carr, his chief financial officer. 3 words. "We have a problem." Jason looked at the message, read it twice, then texted back a single word. "Office." The car changed direction. The rain kept falling. Somewhere across the city, in a warmly lit atrium she had built from the foundation up, Alara Vale stood at the center of the room and did not watch him go. She had already turned away. What Damien Carr showed Jason that night, spread across the glass table in the emergency conference session that ran until 2 in the morning, was not entirely surprising in the way that a structural crack you have ignored for a long time is not entirely surprising when it finally opens into something you can no longer step over. There was movement in the accounts. Not obvious. Not the kind of movement that triggers automated monitoring. The kind that required a human eye trained specifically on this architecture to detect. Someone had been siphoning, slowly, methodically, using a series of nested transaction structures that were sophisticated enough to indicate inside knowledge of the monitoring system itself. "How long?" Jason said. "Best estimate? 14 months. Damien's face had the gray quality of a man who had been awake too long and had bad news to deliver to someone who responded to bad news in ways that made most people prefer to have delivered it from a distance. "How much?" "Total exposure across the structures we've identified so far. We're still mapping it, somewhere between 8 and 12 million. Jason was quiet. "There's more," Damien said. He clearly did not want there to be more. "The structure they're using, the nested architecture. I've seen something like this before. Internally. It's based on the same framework someone used to map our financial monitoring system approximately 3 years ago." "Who mapped it 3 years ago?" Damien looked at him. "Our internal financial monitoring system was audited and restructured internally 3 years ago. It wasn't a contracted external audit. It was done by someone inside the organization, informally, because they found a vulnerability." Jason felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Someone inside," he repeated. Someone who was inside at that time," Damien said carefully, "who may not have had any awareness that the mapping they did would subsequently be used by someone else as a template for—" "Stop." Jason stood. walked to the window. The city below was wet and almost quiet. "You're saying someone used her work?" Damien did not answer, because the answer was already in the room. Elara, who had quietly audited their financial monitoring 3 years ago because she had found a vulnerability and it had bothered her and she had fixed it without being asked. Who had documented everything she did because she documented everything, because that was who she was. Someone inside the organization had accessed her documentation, had taken her framework, had inverted it, weaponized it, used it to move money in the gaps she had identified and closed, or tried to close, and had been doing it for over a year, while she was still his wife, while she was still in the building. "Find out who had access to her documentation," Jason said. "Everyone who touched that audit record. Every name. I want it by morning." He stared out at the rain. He had signed the divorce papers with the certainty of a man who always got what he wanted. He had been so certain about what he was moving toward that he had not looked carefully at what he was leaving behind. Who he was leaving behind. The magnitude of that error was beginning to find its actual shape, and the shape was much larger than he'd thought. The names came back at 4:53 in the morning. Jason was still in the office when Damien walked in with the list, a single printed page, which was Damien's way of communicating that he understood the gravity of what he was delivering and wanted no digital trace of having delivered it. He set it on the glass table and stepped back, putting distance between himself and the information the way you step back from something that might catch fire. Jason picked it up. 7 names. 7 people who had accessed the internal audit documentation Elara had produced 3 years ago during her quiet, unauthorized, entirely effective restructuring of the financial monitoring system. 7 people who had been inside the organization long enough, trusted enough, positioned correctly enough to have touched those files. He read the list twice. His face did nothing. Then he set the page down, very carefully, the way you set down something fragile when you want no one to see your hands are not entirely steady. "Garrett Sohn," he said. Damien exhaled through his nose. He's the only one on that list with both access to the documentation and the technical background to have built the transaction structures we're looking at. Garrett Sohn had been with the organization for 11 years. He ran financial operations across 3 of Jason's legitimate holdings, the import logistics company, 2 commercial real estate entities, and had been considered, without fanfare, one of the 3 or 4 people in the organization whose judgment Jason trusted without requiring verification. He was 41, quiet, precise, and had a daughter in her first year at a university in the Northeast, whose tuition Jason knew because he knew everything about his people. "Where is he now?" Jason said. "His apartment. He's not flagged. He has no idea we're looking. Keep it that way." Jason was already thinking through the geometry, not the emotional geometry, not the betrayal of it, because he would deal with that feeling later when it was useful to deal with it and not before. The operational geometry. What Garrett knew. What Garrett had moved, who Garrett had been moving it for. "I want eyes on him, not his team. People he doesn't recognize. I want to know every communication he's made in the last 90 days. That's going to take time to compile properly." "Then start now." Damien left. Jason stood at the window and watched the city come back to life in the early gray of a November morning. Wet streets catching the first thin light. Delivery vehicles moving through intersections. The machinery of ordinary life grinding forward without awareness of or interest in the particular machinery that was grinding forward up here. He thought about Elara, not about the divorce, not about the opening last night, or the specific way she had looked at him for 3 seconds and then looked through him. He thought about her methodical mind, the way it operated, the way it had always operated, quietly and completely, taking apart whatever problem was in front of it and reassembling it in a form that functioned correctly. He thought about the fact that she had built a monitoring system 3 years ago that was so precise, so correctly structured, that the only way someone had been able to exploit it was by using her own documentation as a map. She had protected him. She had protected him for 5 years, and he had handed her divorce papers and told her to sign them, and she had signed them, and she had walked out the door and built something extraordinary with her own hands, and now the protection she had quietly installed was being weaponized by someone inside his own walls. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, closed his eyes for 4 seconds, Then he picked up his phone and called a number he had not called in 9 months. It rang 3 times. "It's 5 in the morning," Marcus said. "I know, I need to see you." A pause. "When?" "Now." Marcus arrived at the building 40 minutes later, which meant he'd been dressed and moving within 5 minutes of the call, which meant he'd been expecting this call or something like it for a while. He came alone, no driver, took the private elevator that bypassed the lobby security desk, and arrived in the conference room looking like a man who had slept recently and was fully awake, which, at 5:40 in the morning, was itself a kind of information. Jason had coffee on the table. He slid a cup toward Marcus and sat down. "Garrett Sohn," he said. Marcus sat with the cup in both hands and looked at it. Not at Jason, at the cup. "How much do you know? Tell me what you know." "That's not how I want this conversation to go." "Marcus." Jason's voice didn't rise. It never rose. It simply tightened, like a grip. "How much do you know?" Marcus set the cup down, looked up. His face had the quality of a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that setting it down was going to be a relief, even if setting it down in front of this particular person came with its own category of risk. "I know he's been running parallel books on the logistics company since roughly 18 months ago. I know the transaction structures are using internal architecture that came out of the 2021 monitoring audit." A breath. "I know he's not the principal. He's the mechanism. Someone told him to do it and gave him the access and gave him the map." "Who?" "I don't have that confirmed." "Who do you suspect?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The building was quiet around them. 42 floors of pre-dawn silence and the distant sound of the city doing what cities do. "I think you need to look at who had a reason to destabilize your financial infrastructure at a specific moment in time," Marcus said. "And then think about what was happening in your personal life at that moment in time." Jason looked at him. "I'm not making an accusation," Marcus said carefully. "I'm pointing at a question." The question sat between them. Jessian stood up, walked to the window again because it was where he went when he needed to keep his body occupied while his mind worked. Below, the city was waking up properly now. More vehicles, more light. The particular velocity shift of a place moving from night mode to day mode. Serena had returned 8 months ago. They'd been photographed together 6 months ago. The siphoning had been running for 14 months, which meant it had started 2 months before she came back, which meant either the timing was coincidental or someone had been preparing before she arrived, which meant the preparation had preceded the arrival, which meant the arrival was not spontaneous. He turned this over once, twice. Then he put it down, because he did not have enough confirmed information to take it anywhere useful yet, and moving on incomplete information was how you made irreversible errors. "Keep building the map," he said. "Don't touch Garrett yet. I need to know who's above him before we move." Marcus nodded, stood, picked up his coat from the back of the chair. "Marcus?" Jason didn't turn from the window. "You went to see Alara after the divorce." A pause. "Yes." "Why?" "But because she'd caught the Heron deal in 2021 and documented it, and someone inside accessed that documentation. If the people running the Heron deal ever figured out who had caught it, she could have been exposed. She was no longer under organizational protection," Marcus said it flatly, not apologetically, as a statement of operational fact. Someone needed to make sure she understood the exposure. "You went on your own." "Yes." Jason was quiet. "She's not a piece of infrastructure," Marcus said. "She was never just that. Whatever decisions were made about the marriage, she was not just a piece of infrastructure." He left. Jessian stood at the window until the sun finished rising and made the rain-wet city below into something that almost looked clean. Look, guys, Alara found out about Garrett Sohn by accident, which was to say she found out the way she found out most things, because she was paying attention when other people had stopped expecting her to pay attention. She had a meeting scheduled for 11 that morning with a vendor who supplied custom millwork for hospitality properties. The meeting was on the 38th floor of a building in the financial district, and she arrived early because she was always early. And while she waited in the lobby, she opened her email and found a message forwarded by a former colleague, a woman named Dana, who had briefly worked in Jashin's organization's legitimate hospitality arm before moving to an independent consultancy that contained, embedded in a chain of what appeared to be routine vendor correspondence, something that was not routine at all, a reference to a transaction structure. Specific terminology, the kind of language that appeared in internal financial architecture documentation rather than vendor communications. Alara read it twice. Then she photographed the chain with her phone, deleted the email, and sat in the lobby with her hands very still in her lap until the meeting started. She went through the meeting with full attention and appropriate focus because she did not permit ongoing crises to degrade the quality of her present engagement. She signed the preliminary agreement with the millwork vendor, shook hands, and walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and called Dana. "That email you forwarded," she said when Dana picked up, "where did that chain originate?" A hesitation. "It was from the logistics network. Someone sent it to me by mistake, wrong address. The names looked familiar, so I thought you might... I don't know, I didn't think it was important." "It's not a problem. Don't mention it to anyone." She hung up, stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The terminology in that chain matched what she had built 3 years ago. Not close to it, matched it. The specific naming conventions she had used for nested account structures, conventions she had invented that didn't appear in any standard financial documentation, that she had created from scratch because the system she was building didn't have a precedent. Someone was using her framework, and they were using it to move money inside Jason's organization. She had 2 available responses. She could do nothing. Seal this away with everything else she'd sealed away, recognize it as not her problem, proceed with her life. She was not in his organization. She had no obligation. She had built something of her own, and it was growing, and it required everything she had, and the correct response to a man who had signed divorce papers without an apology and handed them across a marble table was to let him deal with the consequences of whatever his organization had become. She stood on the sidewalk for 40 seconds. Then she called Marcus. He met her at a coffee shop 3 blocks from her office. Small, not the kind of place anyone from either of their worlds would think to look for them. He was already there when she arrived, sitting in the back corner with black coffee and the expression of a man who had not slept and was not surprised by the call. She sat down, did not order anything, put her phone on the table between them. "You already know," she said. "We know parts," Marcus said. "We're building the map. Garrett Sohn." His expression didn't change. He was very good at that. "What do you know about Garrett?" "I know that the transaction architecture in that chain uses internal naming conventions I created, which means whoever built it had access to my documentation. And the people who had access to my documentation were a closed list." She looked at him. "How long has it been running?" "Best current estimate, 14 months. She absorbed that. "Who's directing him?" "That's what we don't have confirmed." She looked at her phone on the table between them, looked at it without picking it up. "There's something else." "Tell me." "The Heron deal," she said. "I caught it because I was watching the right vectors. The people who structured it, I've been thinking about this since you came to see me. They weren't random opportunists. They had inside knowledge of the monitoring gaps before I closed them, which means they had inside knowledge of the monitoring architecture before I restructured it." She paused. "Which means someone told them how it worked before I fixed it. Someone who knew what I was finding before I finished finding it." Marcus was very still. "I was documenting in real time," she said. "My working notes were in the internal system. Anyone who had access to the system at the time could have seen what I was identifying before I closed each gap." She met his eyes. "I didn't think about that at the time. I should have." "You weren't thinking about internal threats at the time," Marcus said carefully. "You had no reason to. I had every reason to. I just didn't." She pressed her fingertips to the table surface. "Someone was reading my working notes while I was working. They saw every gap I identified before I closed it. They mapped the architecture from my process documentation. And then they waited." "Waited for what?" "For me to be gone." She said it without particular effect. A factual statement. "The siphoning started 14 months ago. We separated 16 months ago. I was out of the organization before the siphoning began, because while I was in it, I would have caught it. Whoever built this, they knew that. They waited until I was gone." The coffee shop was quiet around them. A barista was doing something with a steam wand at the counter. A man near the window was reading something on a laptop with the focus of someone trying to ignore the world. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Ilara, this is no longer a situation where your exposure is theoretical. I know. If Garrett is moving on direction from someone inside the organization, and if that person has been aware of your documentation, aware of your capabilities, aware that you caught the Heron deal. They know I know too much, she said. Yes, I've been thinking about that. You need protection. She almost laughed, but not quite. I built a company with $4 million in revenue in 9 months. I have 22 employees. I have a property that was written about in 3 national publications this week. If something happens to me, it will be visible. That's its own kind of protection. It's not enough, she agreed. I know. I'm not being reckless. I'm being accurate. She picked up her phone, slid it into her bag, stood. Tell Jason what I've told you. You could tell him yourself. I could. She looked at Marcus with the specific level clarity that she used when she wanted someone to understand something completely without her needing to say it more than once. Tell him. Jason received the information from Marcus at 2:30 that afternoon, standing in his private office on the 42nd floor, with the door closed and his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, because somewhere in the last 18 hours he had stopped performing composed and had simply become whatever he actually was. He listened, did not interrupt. When Marcus finished, he stood for a moment with his hands at his sides. She's right, he said. About all of it. Yes. The timing was deliberate. Yes. Someone inside watched her work, used her documentation, waited for the divorce. He moved to his desk and sat on the edge of it. Whoever is running Garrett was patient enough to wait 16 months. That's not opportunism. That's a strategy. That's someone who had a long-term plan and positioned specifically around her departure. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead, which means they were planning this during the marriage. While she was still here. That's the implication, yes. Which means someone in my organization spent the last several years building a play specifically designed to exploit the window that would open when she left. He looked up. They knew I was going to divorce her. Marcus said nothing. How would they know that? That's the question. The office was very quiet. Outside the windows, the city moved through its afternoon routines, indifferent, continuous, beautifully unconcerned with the specific collapse happening on the 42nd floor of one of its glass towers. Jason thought about Serena. He thought about timing. He thought about the particular way she had appeared 8 months ago. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the kind of controlled, gradual presence that someone with a specific intention applies when they need to appear organic. He thought about the private dinner, the terrace, her hand on his arm, the way she'd said his name. He thought about the fact that she had returned 8 months ago, and the siphoning had begun 14 months ago, and 2 months before that he had told exactly one person, outside of his attorneys, that the marriage to Ilara was ending. One person he'd spoken to candidly about it, not as a decision announced, but as a thing he was thinking, a direction he was moving. He had told that person at a private dinner in the northern part of the city, at a table for 2, in a restaurant where the lighting was dim enough and the seating was private enough that he had felt, for one of the few times in his life, that the conversation was genuinely contained. He had told Serena Hartwell. He had been in contact with her for almost 2 years, off and on. The communication he had told himself was closure, resolution, the tying of an old thread into a clean knot. He had been talking to her for almost 2 years before the divorce. And 18 months ago, 2 months before the siphoning began, he had sat across from her in a dim restaurant and told her the marriage was ending. 2 months later, someone began building a financial extraction structure using the architecture Ilara had built and documented. He sat very still on the edge of his desk. Get me everything on Serena Hartwell, he said. Financial history, organizational connections, who she's spoken to, who she's worked with, who she's been connected to in the last 3 years. All of it. Marcus looked at him with the careful expression of a man who had already been going this direction in his own thinking and had been waiting to see how long it would take Jason to arrive. I'll need 48 hours for something comprehensive. You have 24. Marcus left. Jason sat on the edge of his desk and looked at the city and understood that he had been played. Not clumsily, not carelessly. He had been played with patience and precision by someone who knew him well enough to understand exactly which door to walk through and exactly what he would do when she walked through it. He had done what they expected. He had moved exactly the way they'd planned. He had signed the papers. He had let her go. And somewhere across the city, Alara Vale was sitting in the office she had built, surrounded by the company she had built, doing work that was entirely her own, and the people who had used her departure as the mechanism for a 14-month financial extraction were almost certainly aware that she had not, in fact, gone quietly into the background the way they'd probably expected. She had become visible. She had become powerful. She had become precisely the kind of public figure whose activities were watched and documented and written about, which made her a problem. His phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at it. A message from Serena. A photograph attached. Them, from the previous week, at a gallery opening. She'd written, "Someone sent me this. We look good. Dinner tonight?" He looked at the message for a long time. Then he put the phone face down on the desk and sat in the silence and let the full weight of the last 18 months find its proper shape. It was heavier than he had been prepared for. And it was only beginning. Alara was in a meeting with Priya and Renata when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She glanced at it, meaning to dismiss it. 4 words. "They know, you know." She looked at the text. Her expression did not change. Across the table, Priya was walking through Q4 projections with the focused energy she brought to numbers, her voice steady and precise. Alara set her phone face down on the table. "The yield per key on the Meridian property," she said. "Run it again with a 15% occupancy buffer." "Sure." Priya glanced at her. "You okay?" "Run it again," Alara said. Priya ran it again. Alara sat across from her numbers and her people and the company she had built with her own hands and her own mind, and she breathed slowly, and she thought about 4 words on an unknown screen, and she understood that whatever protective distance she had placed between herself and Jason Voss's world was no longer holding. The distance had never been real. It had only been time, and time, apparently, was up. That was the word Alara couldn't finish thinking before her phone buzzed a second time. Same unknown number, same flat delivery. "Don't go home tonight." Home. She looked at it. The meeting was still happening around her. Priya's voice, the numbers, the Q4 projections laid out in clean columns on the laptop screen, and Alara sat inside all of it and felt the specific quality of stillness that arrives not from calm, but from the body understanding something the mind hasn't fully processed yet. A cellular recognition, the kind that lives below thought. She picked up her phone, typed back, "Who is this?" The message delivered. The typing indicator appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Then, someone who worked for Garrett. She stood up from the table. "Alara," Priya started. "Give me 20 minutes, she said. "Don't leave the building." She walked into her private office, closed the door, and stood with her back against it and her phone in both hands. She called Marcus. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting for her to call, which meant he already knew something was moving. "Someone's contacting me from inside Garrett's operation," she said. "When?" 2 minutes ago. Unknown number. They told me they know I know, and they told me not to go home tonight." A silence that had weight in it. "Where are you now?" "Office." "Stay there. I'm sending someone." "Marcus, stay there." His voice had shifted into the register it used when the conversation was no longer about analysis, when it was about physics. "We've had movement in the last hour. Garrett's gone. Not fled. Gone. His apartment was empty when our people went to do a secondary observation check. Cleaned out. Not the kind of cleaned out that happens when someone packs in a hurry. The kind that happens when someone was told days ago to be ready." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. "He was tipped." "Yes." "From inside your operation." "Yes." She opened her eyes. The wall across from her had a small framed photograph. Not decorative, something she'd put there because she liked it. A black and white image of a coastline she'd visited the summer before she met Jason. Before any of this. When her life had been entirely her own and entirely uncomplicated. She looked at it now and felt something almost like grief for the person standing on that coastline who had not known what was coming. "How many people knew you were watching Garrett?" she asked. 6, Jacian, me, Damien, and 3 operational people I trust. Trust or trusted? A pause. That's the question. Get me out of this building carefully, she said, and then we need to talk about Serena Hartwell. They moved her through the building's service exit 40 minutes later. Not dramatically, not with the kind of visible security apparatus that would have announced itself to anyone watching the street. Just Marcus and a man she didn't know, named Cole, who was large and quiet and moved through space with the specific minimal efficiency of someone trained to be present without being noticed. A car was waiting in the service alley. They drove for 20 minutes through routes that changed direction 3 times. And she sat in the back seat and watched the city rearrange itself outside the window and breathed slowly and did not permit herself to catastrophize, because catastrophizing required imagination and she needed her mind doing something more useful. They ended up at a building in the warehouse district, one of Jashin's, she recognized the architecture, that had been converted internally into what appeared to be a private operations center. Secure. No windows on the ground floor. The kind of space that didn't exist on any public record. Josian was already there. He was standing at a central table covered with printed documents and open laptops when she walked in, and he looked up, and the expression on his face was not the one she was used to from him. Not controlled, not composed, not the particular mask of certainty he'd worn for as long as she'd known him. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours, and had spent most of those hours arriving at conclusions he didn't want to arrive at. Good, she thought, and was briefly ashamed of thinking it, and then was not ashamed because she was also very tired and very certain that tonight was not a night for managing her own responses on behalf of someone else's comfort. You shouldn't have been contacted by his people, Jason said. That means they've been watching you. I know what it means. Alara, what do you have on Serena? She said. The name landed in the room the way she'd intended it to. Not as an accusation, but as a coordinate. A location on a map where everything was pointing. Jason looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to the far end of the table and picked up a folder and brought it to her and set it down between them. She opened it. Okay. The documentation was 23 pages. Marcus had been efficient and thorough in the way that people who have been doing this work for 20 years are efficient and thorough. Not flashy, not narrative, just precise and dense and entirely legible if you knew how to read it. Alara knew how to read it. She went through it standing at the table. Neither Jason nor Marcus spoke while she read. The room had the quality of a space where important information is being processed, and the people who already know the information have enough sense to stay out of the way. Serena Hartwell's financial trail for the previous 3 years was, on the surface, what you'd expect from a woman of her background and social position. Consulting fees, appearance payments, the income of someone who monetized a certain kind of access and social currency without ever having a primary professional identity. Nothing unusual. What was unusual began on page 7, a series of transfers originating from a holding company registered in a jurisdiction that specialized in not asking questions. The holding company had a beneficial owner listed through 3 layers of administrative structure, and Marcus had peeled back each layer with the patient precision of someone who had done this many times. And what was at the center was a name Alara recognized. Dominic Rael. She stopped, looked at the name, read the surrounding context. Dominic Rael ran a consolidation syndicate that operated across 4 cities, with interests in distribution, financial services of a specific kind, and the particular business of acquiring assets from organizations that had been destabilized. He was known in the way that people in Jaishin's world were known, not publicly, not in any record that a normal person would encounter, but as a fixed point on the map of who held power and how and what they wanted. What Dominic Rael had wanted for several years was access to Jason Voss's distribution architecture, not the legitimate holdings. Those had value, but were not the point. The operational infrastructure underneath, the relationships, the routes, the embedded arrangements that had taken Jason 15 years to build and could not be acquired or replicated from the outside. They could only be taken. And they could only be taken if the organization holding them was sufficiently disrupted, sufficiently destabilized, sufficiently distracted. She turned to page 11. Serena Hartwell had received 4 significant transfers from the Rail holding structure in the 18 months prior to her return to the city. The first transfer had arrived 2 weeks before Jason had mentioned to Serena in a private dinner at a dim restaurant in the northern part of the city that his marriage was ending. Alara set the page down, picked up the next one. The second transfer had arrived the week Garrett Sohn began building the extraction architecture. The third had arrived on the date the divorce was finalized. The fourth had arrived 3 weeks ago. She closed the folder, put her hands flat on the table's surface. The table was cold metal, and she focused on that sensation, the specific temperature of it, the texture, because she needed something physical to anchor herself to while her mind completed the calculation she'd been running since page 7. Serena Hartwell had not returned because she still loved Jocelyn Voss. She had returned because Dominic Rael had sent her. She had rebuilt the connection with Jocelyn, or had allowed the connection to rebuild, had made herself available in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, not to reclaim a relationship but to ensure that Jason was sufficiently invested in her presence to be blind to what was moving underneath it. And she had begun before the divorce. She had been in contact with Jocelyn, off and on, the way you manage a long game, for almost 2 years. She had positioned herself as the thing he was moving toward so that he would not notice what he was moving away from. Away from Alara. Away from the financial intelligence that Alara represented. Away from the only person in his organization who had consistently, quietly, without being asked, caught the things that were trying to destroy him. Alara raised her eyes and looked at Jocelyn across the table. He was looking back at her with the expression of a man who has just seen the complete architecture of his own manipulation and cannot yet determine whether to feel rage or something worse than rage. "She told Rael when you told her the marriage was ending," Alara said. Not a question. "Yes." "And Rael moved Garrett into position 2 months later." "Yes." "Using the documentation from my monitoring restructure as the blueprint." "Yes." She nodded once. Slowly. The way you nod when a calculation you've been running confirms the answer you were afraid it would confirm. "Where is she now?" Alara asked. Marcus answered from the other side of the room. "She was at the penthouse as of 3 hours ago. We have—" He stopped. His phone was in his hand. He'd looked at it while he was speaking, and now he had stopped speaking, and the expression on his face was the one that appeared on the faces of people who have just received information that changes the geometry of everything currently in progress. "Marcus," Jason said. "Garrett's been found." Marcus looked up. "Warehouse District, Eastern End." A pause, clean and terrible. "He's dead." The silence that followed had a specific texture. Not shock. Not for Jason. Not for Marcus, who had both been in proximity to violent outcomes enough times that the news of one did not produce the same response it would in people who had not. But a sharpening. The specific sharpening of people who understand that a death in this context is not a conclusion, but a communication. Someone had killed Garrett Sohn before Garrett Sohn could be questioned, which meant someone had known, within the last few hours, that the investigation had found him, which meant the internal leak that had tipped Garrett to run had also, when it became clear that running wasn't going to be sufficient, ensured a more permanent silence. "Who else knew we'd identified him?" Jason said. His voice was flat. The particular flatness of controlled rage, rage that has been directed inward and is being burned as fuel rather than expressed outward. "6 people, Marcus said. "Same 6. "Reduce that to 5, Jason said. "One of them just told Rael's people we were closing in. I need more time to—" "We don't have more time." Jason came around the table, took the phone from Marcus's hand, looked at whatever information was on the screen, gave it back. "Serena needs to be contained before she knows we've made the connection. If Rael's people are already eliminating loose ends, she becomes a liability to them too once she's no longer useful." "If she isn't already," Marcus said. Josiane looked at Alara. She was still standing with her hands flat on the table. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at the opening. Not past her, not through the space she occupied toward something else. At her, specifically and completely. "I need the archive," he said. She returned his gaze without blinking. "What archive?" "Alara." Not hard, not demanding, something else. "The documentation you kept. The 5 years of records. I know you kept them. I know what they contain." He paused. "I need them. Not for leverage. Not to use against anyone in a way that comes back to you. I need them because they are the most complete map of what Rael's people have infiltrated, and I cannot dismantle this without a complete map. She looked at him for a long time. Outside this building, the city was doing what cities do, moving, breathing, unconcerned. But inside this room, in this specific moment, Ilara Vale understood that she had arrived at the junction she had been navigating toward without fully acknowledging since Marcus had appeared at her kitchen table months ago. The moment where the two separate structures of her life, the one she had left and the one she had built, could no longer exist at a safe distance from each other. She had two available choices. She had known, since page 7 of the folder, that she would have two available choices, and she had been processing them while she read, in the background of the reading, the way her mind always processed what was next while attending fully to what was now. She could walk away. She had a company, she had employees, she had a life that was genuinely, entirely, for the first time in years, her own. She could walk out of this warehouse, take Cole in his careful silence and his efficient movement, and go somewhere that was not here, and let Jason Voss deal with the consequences of Jason Voss's decisions. Or she could help, because Dominic Rael's operation had used her documentation as a weapon, had waited for her departure as a precondition, had targeted her, was targeting her, the unknown number, "Don't go home," specifically because she was the person most capable of unraveling what they'd built. They had made this her problem. She had not made it her problem. They had. "If I give you access," she said, "I am not doing it for you. I am doing it because they used my work to build this, and I am not going to let my work be the thing that destroys what I spent 5 years protecting." Jason held her gaze. "Understood. And when this is done," she said, "we are done. Completely. Whatever remains between us professionally, personally, any category, it ends here. I help you close this, and then I go back to my company and my life, and you do not contact me again unless it is a matter of direct and immediate danger to my safety." He was quiet for a moment in which she could see, and she had not permitted herself to see this, had not looked for it, but it was there, and she was very good at seeing what was actually present rather than what she expected to see. Something crossed his face that was not negotiation, was not calculation, was not the particular architecture of a man managing a tactical conversation. It was grief, fast and then gone, but real. "Understood," he said again. She reached into her bag, produced a small drive, not the archive itself, which existed in 3 physically separated locations and would require more than this moment to access, but a key, the first layer of access. She placed it on the table between them. "This gives you the index," she said, "the structure of what I documented. You'll see the scope. Then we discuss how to use it." Marcus moved to pick it up. "Marcus," she said. He stopped. She looked at Jason. "I want to know who the 6th person is. The one inside your operation who's been running information to Rael. Not because I need to watch the outcome. I don't. But because I documented things during the marriage that I didn't understand at the time, that I filed and left unresolved because I didn't have context. If I know who we're looking at, I may be able to identify what I already have that connects them." Jason looked at Marcus. Marcus set the drive down on the table. His expression had changed. A small change, the kind that only registers if you know how to look. A tightening around the eyes, a very slight adjustment in posture. Ilara saw it. She saw it, and she understood it, and the understanding arrived with a cold, clean clarity that she had not anticipated, and that rearranged everything in the room in a single second. She looked at Marcus. He looked back at her. In the 4 seconds that followed, she ran the calculation she should have run months ago, when he had appeared at her kitchen table, when he had told her she was exposed, when he had told her things he said Jason didn't know about, things that Rael's operation would have needed to know before they could have moved the way they moved. Things like whether she had kept records. Things like what she might do with those records. Things like whether, after the divorce, she represented a liability or an asset to the people mapping Jason's organizational architecture. Marcus had come to her kitchen. He had assessed her. He had told her just enough to keep her cautious, and just enough to keep her from going to Jason herself, which had given Rael's people additional months of unimpeded operation. She had thought he came out of loyalty. She understood now what he had actually come to do. She kept her face still. She did not look at Jason. She kept her eyes on Marcus, and she breathed once, steadily, and she moved her hand, casually, without urgency, to the edge of the table, the side closer to the door, and she said, very quietly, "It's him." Marcus moved first. He was fast, faster than she had anticipated, which was her miscalculation. She had been too focused on the realization to properly account for the response, and his hand went to his coat, and Jason was already moving. He came across the table fast. Not around it, across it, one hand flat on the surface, and his body vaulting the edge with the kind of controlled violence that doesn't announce itself before it arrives. And he hit Marcus in the shoulder with enough force to redirect the hand coming out of the coat, and the gun that Marcus had been drawing scraped against the table edge and skittered sideways and hit the concrete floor 3 feet from where Alara was standing. She didn't freeze. She moved left, away from the gun, away from both of them, putting the secondary table between herself and the collision happening in the center of the room, because freezing was what people did when their bodies hadn't been trained to process threat as information rather than paralysis. And she had spent 5 years in close proximity to Jason Voss, and she had learned by necessity rather than design that the correct response to sudden violence was to move and think simultaneously. Jacian had Marcus by the collar and the wall had Marcus by the back, and Marcus was not a small man and he was not unprepared, and what followed was not clean. It was elbows and close quarters leverage and the specific ugly efficiency of 2 men who both knew how this worked, neither of them performing, both of them entirely serious about the outcome. Marcus got a forearm across Jason's throat. Jason took it and used the momentum to drive his knee up, and Marcus buckled, and Jason put him on the floor with a sound that was unambiguous about the amount of force involved. Cole appeared in the doorway of the room. He'd been outside, had heard the movement, arrived with his own weapon drawn, and his eyes doing the rapid triage that trained people do when they enter a scene mid-action, reading threat and assignment simultaneously. "Hold," Jason said. Cole held. Marcus was on the floor. He'd hit the concrete hard and his breathing was audible, ragged, working, the sound of a body that had taken damage and was recalibrating. His hands were visible. The gun was still 3 feet from Alara, who had not touched it and was not going to touch it, because touching it would place her inside this in a way that she was not going to allow. Jason crouched down. His tie was gone somewhere. His shirt had come partially untucked, and there was a red mark developing along his jaw where Marcus had connected with something in the struggle. He looked like what he actually was, stripped of the 42nd floor polish. A man who had built an empire with his hands and his willingness to do what other people were not willing to do, and who had not forgotten how to be that man, even when he wore suits that cost $4,000. He looked at Marcus on the floor. Marcus looked back at him. His breathing was slowing. His face had the quality of a man who has passed through the moment of decision and is now simply inside the consequences. "How long?" Jason said. Marcus said nothing. "Marcus." A single word. All of Jason's weight behind it. 3 years, Marcus said. His voice was flat. Not apologetic, not defensive. The voice of a man who had made choices and was not going to perform regret about them for an audience. "Rael approached me 3 years ago." Jason was very still. 3 years. "Yes." "You were in my house 3 years ago. You were at my table. You were—" He stopped. Reset. "What did you give them? Operational structure, communication patterns, financial architecture overview." Marcus shifted slightly on the floor, testing whether Jason was going to allow it. Jason didn't stop him. He moved to a seated position, back against the wall. "Not personnel, not roots. The architecture. Enough for them to understand where the vulnerabilities were. Enough for them to use Alara's monitoring documentation as a blueprint. They already knew the documentation existed. I confirmed its location." Alara, from her position behind the secondary table, heard this and said nothing. She was looking at Marcus with the expression of a person recalibrating memory, running backward through every interaction, every kitchen table conversation, every piece of information she had shared, and every conclusion she had been steered toward, and finding the seams she had not seen when she was inside them. "You told them she'd kept records," she said. Marcus looked at her. "Yes." "You came to my apartment to assess what I had, whether I was a threat to the operation, and to determine whether you'd go to Jason on your own." He held her gaze. "You didn't. For months. I kept reporting that you were contained. Contained, she repeated. Elara. His voice shifted slightly, not softer, but with a quality in it that she recognized as the specific discomfort of a man who has done something he has rationalized into necessity and is finding the rationalization insufficient in this particular moment with this particular person. I did not want you hurt. That was always a... Don't, she said. Clean, quiet, final. He stopped. Josian stood up from his crouch. He stood over Marcus for a moment, and whatever he was feeling was not visible on his face because he had put it somewhere internal to be dealt with later, and he looked at Cole. Secure him, he said. Separate room. No phone. I'll deal with him when this is finished. Cole moved in. Marcus did not resist. He looked once more at Jason as Cole brought him to his feet. A look that contained something complicated, something between men who have known each other for 11 years. A look that could not be reduced to villain and victim because nothing that had been running this long was ever that clean. Then he was gone through the inner door. Jason stood in the room and breathed. Elara watched him. His back was to her, his hands at his sides, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the specific weight of what had just happened. Not the physical residue of the fight, but the other thing. The understanding that the person he had trusted most completely, longest, most without question, had been a channel through which everything he'd built had been bleeding for 3 years. She did not go to him. She picked up her bag from the floor where it had fallen. She checked that her phone was still in it. She looked at the drive she'd placed on the table, still sitting where she'd put it. Serena doesn't know Marcus is blown, she said. Jason turned. No. Which means Rael doesn't know yet either. We have a window, small one. How small? Marcus had a check-in protocol. When he misses it, they'll know something's wrong. He moved to the table, picked up his phone. His hands were steady. She had always found that specific quality in him. The steadiness under pressure, both reassuring and terrible depending on the context. 2 hours, maybe 3 if they assume he's managing a situation. What's the play? He looked at her. There was a question in the look, not about strategy, about something else, about whether she was still here, not just physically, but in the way that mattered, whether the accumulation of the last 40 minutes had pushed her to the exit she'd said she reserved the right to take. She returned the look without answering the unspoken part. What's the play? She said again. He told her. The plan had 3 components and approximately 90 minutes to execute before the window closed, and the first component required Elara to do something she had not done in 9 months. She had to call Serena Hartwell, not from her own number, from a routing line that Jason's operation maintained for exactly this category of communication. Untraceable, presenting as a generic local number, clean enough to pass casual inspection but not a sustained trace. She sat at the secondary table with the phone in front of her and Jason standing 6 feet away and Cole back at his post by the door after returning from securing Marcus. And she looked at the number on the screen that Jason had pulled from the operational file. She dialed. It rang twice. Hello? Serena's voice, lighter than Elara had expected, given what she now knew lived beneath it. A performance of ease, a person who had been performing ease for so long it had become its own kind of second nature. This is a courtesy call, Elara said. She kept her voice low and altered slightly, not disguised, but flattened, professionalized, the voice of a functionary delivering information rather than a person. You have 40 minutes to leave the city. After that, we cannot guarantee your safety. Silence. Then, who is this? Someone who was told to give you the option of leaving before the window closes. Rael's operation has been compromised. Marcus Drell has been detained. If you are present when the federal contact arrives, you will be included in the documentation. A longer silence. She could hear Serena breathing, the slight change in the quality of it. The way breathing changes when fear moves through a person faster than they can manage it. You're lying, Serena said, but her voice had changed. 40 minutes, Elara said. The choice is yours. She ended the call. Jason was already on another line, speaking in the low, precise cadences of someone issuing orders that had been thought through before this moment and were simply being executed now. She caught fragments, a name, a location, a time. He was calling in people. Not many. The ones he was certain of, which meant the ones who had not been in the six-person circle that Marcus had compromised. She stood up, moved to the door. "Where are you going?" Cole said. Not aggressive, a question with a function. "To do the second part," she said. Josian lowered his phone. "Ilara, the federal contact," she said. "That part wasn't a lie. If you want Rael to go down completely, not just the extraction operation, not just Serena, but the consolidation syndicate and the 3 years of architecture Marcus fed them, you need documentation that holds up outside a warehouse in the district." She looked at him steadily. "I have that documentation. All of it. 5 years. I told you I kept records." She paused. "I know who to call." "That exposes you. My name doesn't have to be on the transmittal. The records speak for themselves." She held his gaze. "Let me make the call." He looked at her for a moment that had the quality of many things compressed into a small space of time. Then he nodded. She stepped outside into the corridor, called a number she had memorized and never written down, the number of a federal financial crimes investigator named Holt she had met 3 years ago at an industry compliance conference and had maintained careful, minimal, entirely appropriate contact with, because she was Ilara Vale, and she did not observe a vulnerability without also identifying the correct channel through which to address it, if the moment ever arrived. The moment had arrived. Holt picked up on the third ring. She spoke for 4 minutes, gave him enough to move on. Specific transaction references, account structures, names, the location of the first access layer of the archive, and nothing more than enough. When she hung up, she stood in the corridor for a moment with her back against the wall and the phone in her hand, and her eyes closed, and she breathed 3 times, and she felt the weight of what she'd just done. Not with regret, not with doubt, but with the specific gravity of someone who understands that some actions have permanent trajectories, and she had just launched one. Then she went back into the room. The second component went wrong at the 40-minute mark. They had expected Serena to run. The call was designed to panic her into movement, and movement would lead to interception. 2 of Jasion's people positioned at the building's exits, a third monitoring the garage. She would be brought in, documents would be recovered, and the federal contact would have a living corroborating witness. What they had not anticipated was that Serena did not panic cleanly. Jason's phone rang at the 40-minute mark. One of his people at the building. He answered, listened for 12 seconds, and his face changed in the way it changed when information arrived that required immediate reassessment. "She called Rael's people before she ran," he said after hanging up. "They sent a car. She's not with our people. She's gone." Ilara stood up. "She's going to Rael directly." "Yes." "If she tells him the operation is blown and names this location, they'll move on us." "Yes." Cole was already at the door on his radio, the particular clipped efficiency of someone shifting from containment mode to something more active. "How many people do you have within response distance?" Ilara said. "Enough." Jason was already moving, coat on, phone in his hand. He looked at Ilara with an expression that combined something operational with something else. Something she identified, in the half-second she had available to identify it, as the specific fear of a man who has already lost something important and is standing next to the possibility of losing something else, and is finding the mathematics of that unbearable. "You need to go somewhere secured," he said. "Not here. Cole will take you." "No." "Ilara." "I have the archive access codes in my head," she said. "Not on any device, not written anywhere. If something happens to me before I've transmitted the full documentation to Holt, you have the index and nothing else, and the index without the underlying records is not enough to build on." She looked at him. "So I'm not going somewhere secured and waiting. I'm staying in the operational center of this until it's done." He looked at her. "You need me functional," she said. "That means you need me present. Make the calculation." He made it. She could see him make it. The specific rapid assessment of a man who has spent 15 years making calculations under pressure, weighing variables, running outcomes. And she could see the moment he arrived at the answer she had already arrived at, and the moment he accepted it, and the moment after that, which was the moment he accepted something else, that she was not a person he could move or contain or manage, that she had never been that person, and he had simply, for years, not been paying close enough attention to know it. "Stay behind Cole," he said. "Acceptable," she said. They moved. Chuck. The next 40 minutes had the quality of controlled chaos. The specific operational texture of people moving fast through a situation that is changing faster than any plan can account for, requiring constant real-time adjustment. The decisions coming in rapid succession with no space between them for anything as luxurious as certainty. Jason's people arrived in waves. 3 from the northeast, 2 from the west side, 1 from a position that Alara didn't track because she was managing her own position and her own requirements. They moved through the warehouse district in vehicles that did not attract attention, communicating on frequencies that Marcus had not had access to. Jasion had maintained a secondary communication structure, a backup system, and this specific backup system was one of 3 things in his operational life that Marcus had never been fully read into, which Alara understood only later was not paranoia but instinct, the specific instinct of a man who had learned young that you kept certain doors closed even from the people closest to you. The irony of that, in the context of their marriage, was not lost on her. She filed it away. Rael's response arrived at the 50-minute mark. Not as many people as she had expected. 4 vehicles, which indicated either that Rael had not fully understood the exposure yet, or that he was running a containment operation rather than an escalation, trying to recover documentation and eliminate the immediate problem without creating the kind of visible conflict that attracts the kind of attention that doesn't go away. They hit the warehouse from the north and east simultaneously. What followed was loud and brief and entirely without the choreographed elegance of anything fictional. It was disorganized in the specific way that real violence is disorganized. Multiple things happening in multiple locations with incomplete information and the constant requirement to make decisions based on what you could hear and see rather than what you knew. Alara was in the inner room with Cole when the north entrance was breached. Cole put himself between her and the door with the professional automaticity of someone who has done exactly this before. And she stood behind him in the space between the secondary table and the wall, and she breathed through her nose and kept her mind doing what it needed to do, processing information as it came in, updating the picture, staying functional. She heard Jasion's voice from the outer room. Not words, the tone, command, direction, the specific velocity of someone managing a situation in real time. Then a sound she recognized as a shot, and then another, and then a sustained period of sound that compressed time in the way that high-threat situations compress time, and was probably 40 seconds but registered as much longer. Then quiet. The particular quality of quiet that follows when something has stopped. Cole looked at the door. His radio crackled. He listened. His posture changed slightly. The specific release of tension in the shoulders that happens when threat assessment moves from active to resolved. "Clear," he said. Not to her. Into the radio. Then he looked at her. "We're clear." She moved to the door. He let her pass. The outer room had the aftermath texture of somewhere things had happened quickly and without ceremony. Overturned furniture, 2 of Rael's people on the floor with zip restraints applied by Jason's. A smell in the air that she identified and did not name. 3 of Jason's people were visible. 1 was sitting against the wall with his hand pressed against his upper arm, expression tight, not critical but clearly dealing with damage. Jason was standing in the center of the room. He had a cut above his left eye that had bled down the side of his face, and he hadn't wiped it, and he was looking at something on his phone, a message or a location, she couldn't see which, with the focus of a man who had registered the damage to his own body and had assigned it a priority below whatever he was looking at. He looked up when she walked in. The cut. The blood. His shirt was fully untucked now, one cuff torn. He looked nothing like the man who had sat across a marble conference table 11 months ago and slid divorce papers across the surface with the cold certainty of a man who always got what he wanted. He looked real. She had not seen him look this real in years. "Serena's in a vehicle heading for the East Line district," he said. "Rael's secondary location. She took physical documentation with her. She has a drive. Whatever she pulled from the operational files before she ran, she's moving it to Rael directly. If it gets to Rael, he can rebuild. Different architecture, different people, but the core of what he's built using what Marcus fed him. He keeps it, and in 6 months he's operational again." Jason looked at her. "The drive is what Holt needs. Without it, the federal case has the archive documentation you called in, but it doesn't have the proof of how the operation was constructed using inside information. It doesn't have the rail to Serena transfer records in original form. A beat. I need that drive. Then go get it, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The cut above his eye was still bleeding slowly. He didn't touch it. She's going to tell Rael everything, he said, about tonight, about Marcus, about you. He paused. If Rael understands what you represent to his exposure, what you have in that archive, he is going to make you a priority, not a complication, a priority. She understood what he was telling her. She received it clearly and completely. I know, she said. I can't protect you and go after the drive at the same time. I'm not asking you to protect me, she said. I'm asking you to go get the drive. She looked at him steadily. I'll transmit the archive access to Holt from here. All of it, not just the first layer. If Rael gets to me before you get to Serena, Holt still has everything he needs to build the case. She paused. And Rael will know that. Once the transmission goes out, I become less valuable as a target. Less valuable is not the same as safe. Go, Jason. He looked at her. She looked at him. The room was very quiet around them, and the cut above his eye had tracked a thin line down to his jaw, and he was the most present she had ever seen him. No mask, no performance, no management of the space between himself and the world. Just here, in this room, looking at her. When this is over, he said, and then stopped. She waited. He didn't finish the sentence. She could see it in him. The thing he had started to say, the direction it was going, and the precise moment he understood that this particular thing did not belong in this particular moment. That saying it here would be saying it in the wrong place for the wrong reasons. That if there was something to say, it needed to exist somewhere other than the aftermath of violence and fear and the specific distorted gravity of crisis. He was right about that. She acknowledged it silently. When this is over, she said quietly, completing the sentence for him in the only way that was true, it's over. Something crossed his face. She did not look away from it. Then he moved. He was at the door in 4 strides, his people organizing around him, the vehicle waiting outside, and just before he cleared the threshold, he turned once. Not a long look, not a dramatic beat, just a turn of his head, a fraction of a second where his eyes found hers across the room, and then he was gone. Alara turned to Cole. I need a secured connection and 10 minutes. Cole produced a device from inside his coat. It's clean. She sat down at the table in the room that smelled like the aftermath of everything, and she opened the connection and she began transmitting the archive. All 5 years of it, every document, every record, every quiet, careful observation she had made and filed and kept against a day she had hoped would never arrive. To the federal investigator who was, she now knew, already moving. Her hands were steady. Outside, the city moved. Somewhere across it, Jason was driving fast toward a woman who had used him, toward a drive that contained the evidence of everything that had been done to the organization he'd spent 15 years building, toward the final confrontation of a deception that had cost more than either of them had fully calculated. Alara transmitted the last file. Hit send. Watched the confirmation appear on the screen. Done. She set the device on the table, put her hands flat on the surface, breathed once. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it. Not a text this time. A photograph. The photograph showed the entrance to the Oren Meridian property. Her property, her building, the atrium she had stood inside 11 months ago and permitted herself exactly the amount of time it took to understand what she had. The photograph on her phone showed the front entrance of the Oren Meridian property at night. Her building, her atrium, the warm light bleeding through the glass doors onto the wet sidewalk, and standing at the entrance, partially obscured by the angle of the shot, were 2 people who had no business being there at 11:43 on a Thursday night when the property was closed. Alara stood up. Cole. He was already looking at her. He'd read her face the way trained people read rooms. Not the surface of it, but the information underneath. My building, she said. She turned the phone so he could see the photograph. He looked at it for 1 second. Then he was on his radio. She called Priya. 3 rings. 4. Then, hello? Priya's voice had the slightly blurred quality of someone pulled from near sleep, and Alara felt something tighten in her chest because Priya was 29 and brilliant with numbers and had no idea what category of world she had been peripherally adjacent to by working for Alara Vale. "Where are you right now?" Alara said. "Home. I left the office around 9. Why, what?" "Stay home. Don't go to the property tonight. Don't call anyone from the office. I'll explain tomorrow." "Alara, you're scaring me." "Good," she said. "Stay scared and stay home." She hung up. Cole had finished his radio exchange. He looked at her with the expression that meant the picture was not good, but was not yet catastrophic. Two of Rael's people. They went in through the service entrance, same entry we used to move you out earlier tonight. Someone gave them the access point. Marcus. Marcus had been to her building. She had allowed it because she had trusted him, had let him inside the operational geography of her professional life in ways that she had not fully audited because she had believed he came out of something genuine, and she had been wrong about that, and here was the cost of being wrong about it. Are they still inside? Unknown. Our person on the street lost visual when they went in. She was already moving toward the door. "Ms. Vale, my building has 22 employees whose personal contact information is in the administrative files on the second floor," she said without turning around. "Their home addresses, their emergency contacts. If Rael's people are in there collecting documentation on who works for me, on who has been proximate to whatever they think I have, those are 22 people who become exposed through no choice of their own." She turned then, looked at Cole directly. "I am going to my building. You can come with me, or you can call Jason and explain why you didn't. Choose fast." Cole chose fast. He was a practical man. They reached the Oren Meridian property in 11 minutes. The street out front looked the way it always looked at this hour. Quiet, wet, the warm light through the glass doors appearing ordinary and undisturbed. Cole parked half a block east in shadow, and they sat for 90 seconds while he made contact with his people, and Alara looked at the building and thought through the layout with the precision of someone who had designed the space from the foundation and knew every room, every access point, every corridor. The service entrance was on the western side. It required a key card and a 4-digit code. The code had been changed when the property opened. She had set it herself, but the access architecture was something Marcus had been in proximity to, and she no longer trusted any assumption she'd made on the basis of what Marcus had not known. 2 entry points, she said to Cole. Service entrance west, emergency stairwell exit south. The main entrance is glass. Anyone inside would see approach. "I go in first," Cole said. "You go in simultaneously," she said. "Service entrance. I take the lobby." "That's not—" "They're here for documentation that relates to me," she said. "If they see you without me, they take what they have and disappear. If they see me, they stop moving. I'm what they're looking for." Cole looked at her with the expression of a man who understood the logic and found it deeply uncomfortable and was going to comply anyway because the logic was sound. "If anything moves wrong," he said, "you go flat and you stay flat." Acceptable. She got out of the car. The lobby of the Oren Meridian property at night was a different thing than the lobby during business hours. The house lighting was at 20%, enough to navigate, not enough to read by. And the living greenery that lined the atrium walls was dark masses of shape rather than the precise curated installation it was in daylight. The cedar and citrus scent was still there. It was always there. She had chosen it specifically because she wanted the building to smell like itself at every hour. She walked through the main entrance with her key card. The door unlocked with the soft mechanical sound she had heard hundreds of times, and stood in the lobby and listened. Footsteps. Second floor. Moving at the pace of people who believe they are unobserved. Not rushed, not careful. The easy pace of an operation proceeding without interference. She crossed the lobby to the stairwell. The stairwell was concrete and steel, designed to be functional without being visible to guests, and it amplified sound in the specific way that enclosed vertical spaces amplify sound. She could hear them more clearly now. 2 people, one moving, one stationary. She could tell by the rhythm, one set of footsteps tracking back and forth while the other remained in a single position. She went up. The second floor was administrative. Her office, the records room, the server closet that contained the backup systems for the property's operational software. She reached the top of the stairwell and stopped with her hand on the door and breathed once and pushed it open. The corridor was lit by emergency strips only. At the far end, outside the records room, one of Rael's people was standing with his back to her, a device in his hand that she recognized after a half-second as a portable drive reader. He was copying files, physically, from the records room's backup server access panel, which was mounted in the corridor for maintenance access. She did not make a sound. The other one was inside her office. She could see the light through the glass partition. A flashlight moving across surfaces, methodical, the search pattern of someone who has been told what to look for and is looking for it. She had 3 seconds before the one at the end of the corridor turned around, because people doing methodical work in spaces they believe are empty develop a rhythm, and his rhythm was going to bring him back around in approximately 3 seconds. She used them. She crossed the corridor in 4 steps, completely silent on the polished concrete in the flat-soled shoes she'd put on that morning in what felt like a different era, and she hit the emergency alarm panel mounted beside the records room door with the flat of her hand. The alarm was not subtle. It was not designed to be subtle. It was a full-spectrum building alarm. Lights, sound, the specific overwhelming combination of stimuli designed to produce immediate evacuation behavior in any human nervous system, trained or untrained. The man at the panel spun. She was already moving sideways into the alcove beside the records room door, putting the wall between herself and him, and she heard him swear and heard the device clatter and heard the office door burst open as the second one came through. And then she heard a third sound, from the stairwell at the other end of the corridor. That was Cole arriving. What happened next was fast and loud, and she stayed in the alcove with her back to the wall, and the alarm doing what alarms do, and she counted seconds, and focused on her breathing because her heart was doing something loud, and she needed the rest of her to be quiet. 40 seconds. 50. Then Cole's voice raised over the alarm. Clear. She stepped out of the alcove. Both of Rael's people were on the floor. Not damaged, restrained. Cole and the person who had arrived with him managing the situation with the efficient brevity of people who do this. The portable drive reader was on the floor beside the records room door. She picked it up. Checked the copy status on its screen. 14%. They hadn't gotten much. She disconnected the reader from the access panel, removed the drive, and put both in her bag. Shut the alarm off, she said to no one in particular. Cole found the panel. The building went quiet. The quiet was enormous. What? She was sitting on the lobby steps, the interior steps, the ones that curved down from the mezzanine level, the ones she had spent 3 weeks arguing with the architect about because she wanted them to have a specific radius that no standard specification accommodated. When her phone rang, Jasian. She answered. We have her, he said. He sounded like a man who had been running and had stopped, the particular compression in a voice when the body is managing exertion. She's contained. The drive is secured. Rael's people were at my building. A silence. Are you? Fine. They got 14% of whatever they were copying before the alarm went off. Cole has them. A longer silence. She could hear him breathing. Jasian. I know, he said. I know. He stopped. Are you at the building now? Yes. Stay there. I'm coming. She looked at the lobby around her. Her lobby. The greenery and the stone and the 20% lighting and the cedar and citrus that was always there. She had built this from a number in a spreadsheet and a conviction and 9 months of focused ferocity, and 2 of Rael's people had walked in through the service entrance tonight and tried to copy her files, and they had gotten 14%, and she had the drive in her bag, and the alarm had done its job. Her building had protected itself, in a manner of speaking. She almost smiled at that. Okay, she said. Indeed. He arrived 22 minutes later. The cut above his eye had been taped. Someone had found a medical kit at some point in the last hour, and the tape was white against his skin and slightly crooked, applied in a hurry by someone who was not a medical professional. His coat was gone. He came through the main entrance and found her on the lobby stairs and stopped at the bottom of them and looked at her with an expression that contained every hour of the previous night in it. She looked back at him. Serena, she said. He came up 2 steps, sat on the stair below her, not beside her, below, which put them at approximately the same eye level, which she recognized as intentional even if he hadn't consciously decided it. She had the drive and a physical folder of documents she'd pulled from the operational files. The drive has the rail transfer records, original files, unaltered. Holt can use them. He looked at his hands. She's with Holt's people now. She started talking in the car. The kind of talking that happens when someone realizes the side they chose has stopped protecting them. Alara nodded. Marcus will talk too, he said. Not out of principle, out of the same calculation. He spent 3 years feeding Rael's operation, and he has nowhere left to go that Rael's people won't eventually find him, and he's not suicidal. He paused. It's enough. Between the archive you transmitted, the drive, and 2 cooperating witnesses, it's enough to bring Rael's operation down completely. Good. He was quiet. The lobby was quiet around them. Outside, through the glass doors, the city was doing what it did at this hour. Thin traffic, wet streets, the distant machinery of a place that doesn't stop. I almost lost you tonight, he said. He said it to his hands, not to her, and she understood that this was the only way he could say it, without eye contact, without the performance of eye contact, just the raw fact of it landing somewhere it could be heard. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the side of his face, the tape, the jaw, the particular exhaustion in the set of his mouth. And she thought about the man who had slid divorce papers across a marble table 11 months ago with the cold certainty of a man who always got what he wanted. He did not look like that man right now. He looked like a man who had been stripped of every layer of certainty and had found out what lived underneath, and what lived underneath was not what either of them might have expected. Something simpler, something that had been there all along, she suspected, buried under the fortress architecture he had constructed so thoroughly that even he hadn't known it was there. You didn't almost lose me, she said. You lost me 11 months ago. He looked up. What happened tonight is separate, she said. What happened tonight is the consequence of choices that were made before the divorce papers, and after them, and by people other than either of us. I helped because the documentation was mine, and the operation used it, and I was not going to let my work be the instrument of your destruction. She held his gaze. Not because of what we were, because of who I am. He held her gaze without looking away. I know the difference. Do you? Yes. He said it quietly and without qualification, and she believed him, which was its own kind of painful, because there was a version of this moment, a lesser version, an earlier version, a version that lived in the part of her that had loved him genuinely and been genuinely invisible to him, that wanted to take the belief and build something on it. She recognized it. She looked at it honestly. Then she let it go. I know you do, she said. That's why this conversation is happening instead of nothing. You earned this conversation. She looked at the lobby, her building. You didn't earn anything beyond it. He was very still. I'm not punishing you, she said. I need you to understand that. This isn't punishment. I'm not doing this because you hurt me, and I want you to feel what hurt feels like. She paused. I'm doing it because I know exactly what I'm worth now. I built that knowledge myself, in 9 months, with my own hands and my own mind, and no one gave it to me and no one can take it from me. And what I am worth is not a second attempt. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. One single nod, slow and genuine. The nod of a man who has received something difficult and is accepting it without negotiating against it. It was the most honest thing she had seen him do in the 8 years she had known him. She stood up from the stairs. He stood too. They were facing each other in the lobby of the building she had built, in the middle of a night that had cost both of them something real, and the distance between them was exactly what it should be. Present, acknowledged, unbridgeable, not because of anger, but because of truth. Take care of your operation, she said. Whatever it looks like after this, whatever you rebuild it into, do it honestly. She picked up her bag from the step. You're capable of that. I watched you be capable of that for years when you chose to be. Alara. She stopped. He didn't say anything else for a moment. She waited, because she had learned the particular patience required to wait for Jason Voss to find the words for something he hadn't planned to say. I'm sorry, he said. Not for tonight. Not for the operation, or Marcus, or Serena, or the specific accumulated damage of the last 11 months. She understood the scope of what he was apologizing for, and it was larger than any of that, and it was real. She received it, let it land, didn't dismiss it, and didn't use it. I know, she said. Then she walked through her lobby and out through the glass doors and into the city, which was wet and cold and beautifully indifferent, and she did not look back. The legal proceedings took 4 months to reach the point where the primary structure of Rael's operation was formally dismantled. The federal case was built on 3 foundations: the archive documentation Alara had transmitted, the drive recovered from Serena's possession, and the cooperating testimony of both Serena Hartwell and Marcus Drell, who had each, in the calculating way of people who understand that the ship is going down, and the only question is whether you're on it or in a lifeboat, decided that cooperation was the correct strategic choice. Dominic Rael was indicted on 14 counts. He did not go quietly, because men who have spent decades building criminal infrastructure rarely go quietly, but he went. Garrett Sohn's death was investigated as a homicide connected to the operation. The investigation was thorough and eventually conclusive. Marcus Drell received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, which was the outcome the law allowed, and which Alara received when she heard it with something that was not exactly peace but was adjacent to it: the specific equanimity of someone who has stopped needing a particular outcome in order to move forward. Serena Hartwell received immunity in exchange for full cooperation and relocated quietly to somewhere that did not intersect with Alara's world or Jacian's. She had not been stupid, only mercenary in a way that had eventually outrun her ability to manage the consequences. Alara did not spend significant time thinking about her. Jacian restructured. It was not a simple or a fast process. The exposure of Marcus's 3-year information pipeline meant that the operational architecture of every element Marcus had touched required assessment, and in most cases, rebuilding. He did it. He brought in people whose loyalty had been established through means other than Marcus's vetting, people he verified himself. And he rebuilt with the specific thoroughness of someone who has learned what it costs to trust incompletely. He also made a decision that surprised the people who knew him, which was that he reduced the criminal infrastructure substantially. Not completely. He was not a different man, not transformed into something he had never been, but substantially. He kept what could be defended and what could be justified, and he let the rest go, quietly, methodically, the way he did everything. It was not a moral conversion. It was a man deciding, after a specific kind of reckoning, what he actually wanted his remaining years to look like, and finding that the answer was different from what he had previously assumed. He did not contact Alara. He had said he would not, and he was a man of his word about specific things, and this was one of them. The Oren Hospitality Group opened its second property 8 months after the night of the Warehouse District, in a coastal city 300 miles south. It was larger than the Meridian property, more ambitious in scope, and it was written about extensively in the publications that covered the hospitality industry, and those pieces contained interviews with Alara Vale that were notable for their precision. She said exactly what she meant, no more, no less, with the specific economy of someone who had spent years managing the gap between what she meant and what she said, and had simply stopped maintaining that gap. Priya became a partner. Saul and Renata were given equity stakes that reflected what they had actually contributed to the company's success, which was considerable. Alara hired a director of security whose professional background was operational rather than decorative, because she had learned a specific lesson about the relationship between professional success and exposure, and she had no intention of learning it twice. She had lunch with Cassian Ward, the real estate developer, 3 times over the following months, and on the third lunch, he asked if she would consider consulting on a development project he was structuring in the Northeastern Corridor. And she said she would consider it, and she did consider it, and she said yes. She did not date anyone that year, not from grief, not from absence of opportunity, but from a clear-eyed understanding of what she needed the year to be. A year of full ownership of herself, of her attention, of her choices, unmediated by anyone else's requirements or presence or gravity. She gave herself that year as a deliberate act, the way you give yourself something you have earned. She ran. In the mornings, before the office, through the riverfront district near her apartment, the same apartment on Meridian Street that she had moved into after the divorce, which she had expanded when the lease on the adjacent unit became available, which now had bookshelves along 2 walls and a kitchen that had hosted actual dinner parties and a blue sofa that was still too comfortable to be fashionable, and that she had no intention of replacing. She ran and thought and came back and made coffee and went to work. The work was extraordinary. The work was the thing she had discovered she was actually made of when everything else had been stripped away. And she did not take it for granted for a single day, because she understood with the clarity of someone who has built from nothing that everything built from nothing can become nothing again if you treat it as permanent. She treated it as earned, renewable, hers. A year and 3 months after the night in the warehouse district, she received a letter, physical, handwritten. Her name on the envelope and handwriting she recognized immediately, and with the specific quality of recognition that lives in the body. A contraction somewhere in the chest, fast and involuntary, noted and then released. She opened it. It was not long, 4 paragraphs. She read it at her kitchen table in the morning with coffee going cold beside her. He had sold the tower, not the legitimate holdings, those he kept, restructured, managed. But Voss Tower, with his name on it in steel letters 12 feet tall, he had sold it to a development group that was converting it into mixed-use residential, which meant that in 18 months his name would come down off the building and the building would become something else entirely. He wrote that he was well. He wrote that the legal proceedings were resolved and the operational restructuring was essentially complete, and he was now doing something he had not done in 15 years, which was operating at a pace that allowed him, occasionally, to stop moving and consider where he was, rather than only where he was going. He wrote that he hoped she was well. He wrote, in the last paragraph, that he had been to the Oran Meridian property on a Thursday evening 3 weeks ago. He had not made a reservation because he had not known whether he was actually going to walk in until he was standing outside, and then he had walked in, and he had sat at the bar in the atrium and had a drink that he didn't catch the name of, but that was exactly right for the occasion. And he had sat in the space she had built and understood again, as he had understood the first night, but more completely now, the way you understand things more completely when you have had time to turn them over, what it meant that she had built it. He wrote that he was not writing to reopen anything. He was writing because he had promised himself honesty as a new operating condition, and the honest thing was to tell her that he had been there, and that it was remarkable, and that he was glad it existed in the world. He did not include a return address. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it, put it back in the envelope, and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. She thought about the man who had written it, not the man of the marble conference room and the cold certainty, but the man on the lobby stairs with the crooked tape above his eye, and also the man before either of those, the 24-year-old who had walked into an empty room and been still until everyone understood, and all the versions between and after. She thought about the specific complexity of a person, any person, when you see them fully rather than only in the frame you have assigned them. She thought about what she had built, and what she had lost, and what she had found, and what she had become in the finding of it. She did not write back, but she did, after she finished her coffee and stood to rinse the mug, allow herself a moment, brief and private and entirely her own, of something that was not forgiveness exactly, but was in its neighborhood. The specific softening that happens when you have carried something long enough and have become strong enough that you can set it down without it, meaning that the thing it was didn't matter. It had mattered. It was not her whole story. She rinsed the mug, put on her coat, left for the office. The city on a November morning, a year and 3 months after the night everything changed, was the same city it had always been, indifferent, continuous, beautifully unconcerned with the specific histories being navigated through its streets. Rain sometimes. Cold settling in. The particular smell of a place that has survived many winters and will survive many more. Alara Vale moved through it at her own pace, toward her own building, carrying the accumulated weight of everything she had been through and the specific lightness that comes when you have learned, really learned, in the body as well as the mind, that you are sufficient, that you were always sufficient, that the years of invisibility were not evidence of your smallness, but of someone else's failure of attention, and that failure had been theirs to carry, not yours. She had been someone's wife. She had been quiet and overlooked and essential and unacknowledged, and she had endured and she had signed the papers, and she had walked out through a door that closed with a soft, precise click. And then she had built something real. She walked into Oran Meridian at 8:43 in the morning, said good morning to the staff by name, took the stairs to the second floor, put her bag down in her office, and went to work. Outside the window, the city moved. The rain, when it came, fell on everything equally, on towers with names on them and towers without, on the people who had power and the people who were building it, on the streets that connected them and the distances that did not close. It fell on a woman at a desk on the second floor of a building she owned, working at the particular focused velocity of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why, and does not require anyone's witness to make it real. It fell, and the city breathed, and the story that people would eventually tell, in the way that cities accumulate stories, in the way that extraordinary things become compressed into legend through the retelling, was not the story of the mafia boss who signed the papers. It was the story of the woman who signed them too, and walked out, and built.